Long before written constitutions, before gavels echoed in courtrooms and lawmakers drafted policy in distant chambers, Africa had laws, divine laws. These weren't man-made decrees etched into parchment or enforced by armies. They were cosmic truths, inherited from the ancestors and whispered through the rhythm of the land itself. They were called by names like Omenani and Ma'at. They didn't come from politics, they came from the gods. To live under these laws was not to submit, it was to align. To violate them was not just to commit a crime, it was to disturb the sacred balance of life. These laws weren't rules you memorized, they were principles you embodied. They governed more than behavior, they governed energy. They weren't upheld by judges in robes, but by elders with wisdom, by diviners reading the will of the unseen, by the ancestors whose presence was as real as the soil beneath your feet. In these systems, law was not separate from spirit. It was spirit. And justice didn't mean punishment. It meant restoration, rebalancing, and return to harmony. But over time, as foreign powers invaded and colonized, these divine systems were buried under layers of control, coercion, and confusion. Today, many of us walk through life disconnected from this ancient order, unaware that something profound has been lost. What governed African kingdoms before colonization? What made them fair, balanced, and sacred? How did entire civilizations thrive under laws that were not written by men, but remembered by the soul? These are not just historical questions. They are spiritual awakenings waiting to happen. Because once, Africa knew how to live in alignment with the cosmos. And maybe, just maybe, that knowledge was never destroyed. Maybe it's still alive, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be remembered. In pre-colonial Africa, law was never merely a set of civil agreements. It was spiritual alignment, a living connection between human behavior and the fabric of the cosmos. Every action, every decision, every word spoken had resonance, not just in society, but in the universe itself. Law was not separate from life. It was life guided by divine rhythms and ancestral memory. When a person stepped out of alignment, it wasn't simply a social offense, it was a spiritual disturbance. Breaking the law meant more than breaking trust. It meant breaking harmony, and to break harmony was to break the universe. The elders, the priests, the diviners, they were not just community leaders. They were custodians of balance. These were not political roles, but sacred responsibilities. Elders were vessels of memory, carrying the codes passed down through generations. Priests were mediators between the visible and the invisible. Diviners were interpreters of divine will, capable of discerning the unseen roots of disorder. Justice was not handed down from authority, it was revealed through spirit. And when justice was carried out, its goal was never revenge or retribution, it was restoration. The wrongdoer was not condemned. They were guided back into balance, back into the flow of Ma'at, Omenani, and all that upheld order in the cosmos. Every community understood that the world functioned in an interconnected web of forces. One person's dishonesty could tilt that web. One act of greed could cause drought, disease, or death. So law wasn't something external to fear, it was something internal to protect. Rituals were not symbolic, they were corrective. Offerings weren't bribes to gods, they were acts of rebalancing. And spiritual offenses weren't just taboos, they were tremors that echoed through family lines, land, and time. This is what set African divine law apart from civil law as understood in the West. It was not born out of contracts or constitutions. It did not evolve from war or the need to control. It emerged from an understanding of sacred balance between earth and sky, man and woman, body and spirit, community and cosmos. The idea that justice is harmony, not force, shaped how people lived, loved, governed, and healed. When someone broke a law, the community didn't just ask, "What did you do?" They asked, "What went out of balance? What spirit was offended? What ritual must be done to make things whole again?" The law wasn't something to fear, it was something to live by, because it mirrored the natural laws that govern all things: the tides, the seasons, the breath. There was no separation between the sacred and the legal. Every judgment, every ceremony, every lesson passed to the next generation was part of a cosmic system. To break the law was to break the universe. That wasn't metaphor, it was reality. Because when spiritual order collapsed, it brought chaos into every layer of life, from the fields that stopped bearing fruit, to the families that fell apart, to the minds that went restless. Balance wasn't just a moral ideal, it was survival. It was peace. It was the heartbeat of civilization. This concept of law as cosmic is not something to admire from a distance. It challenges us to rethink everything we've been taught about justice, about order, about what it means to live truthfully. In a world now obsessed with punishment, surveillance, and fear, Africa once built entire nations around something far more powerful: the commitment to spiritual harmony. Not to dominate, but to restore. Not to isolate, but to reconnect. Not to threaten, but to heal. Among the Igbo people of southeastern Nigeria, law was not written in ink or enforced by force. It was remembered through practice, preserved through reverence, and passed on through generations as Omenani. The word itself means what is done among the people, but its true meaning reaches far beyond custom or habit. Omenani is ancestral law, a sacred code rooted not in human invention but in spiritual instruction. It is the invisible blueprint that shaped every aspect of Igbo life, drawn not from rulers, but from the rhythms of the land, the voices of the ancestors, and the demands of the divine. Omenani governed how people lived in community. It structured the family, defining roles not by domination, but by duty, mutual respect, and balance. Marriage was not just a union between individuals, but a covenant between lineages, sanctified by spirit, recognized by ancestors, and guided by specific rites that ensured harmony. Land inheritance followed a sacred order, not simply to protect property, but to honor ancestral claims and ensure generational continuity. Every act involving land was a spiritual transaction because the land itself was alive, inhabited by ancestors, protected by deities, and watched over by Allah, the earth goddess. Conflict resolution under Omenani was not adversarial, it was restorative. Disputes were not left to escalate into violence or punishment. They were brought before elders, not because elders held power, but because they held wisdom. These elders, especially those who had undergone the sacred Anzena Ozo initiation, were living embodiments of ancestral law. Their authority came from their moral standing, their ritual purity, and their proven alignment with the divine. They didn't pass judgment. They interpreted its spiritual consequence. They weren't enforcers. They were harmonizers. Violating Omenani was not just a breach of social order. It was a disruption of spiritual equilibrium. Some transgressions were so grave, they were considered unso abla, abominations against Allah herself. These were not minor offenses. They were spiritual violations that corrupted the land, offended the ancestors, and endangered the community. Adultery, incest, desecration of sacred groves, spilling innocent blood, all were considered unso Allah. And the response was not simply punishment, it was purification. The offender would be called to confession, not for public shame, but to restore spiritual alignment. Sacrifices, libations, and public reconciliation were often required to repair the rupture between the human world and the divine. What makes Omenani so profound is that it lives not just in rule but in rhythm. It was not legislated from a palace. It was inherited from the gods. The Ndichi, the ancestral spirits, were believed to be active participants in the enforcement of Omenani. When harmony was broken, it wasn't only the living who noticed. Misfortune, illness, and unrest were interpreted as signs that the invisible world had been disturbed. And it was through ritual, prayer, and alignment that balance could be restored. This sacred system of law did more than govern behavior. It shaped worldview. Children were raised to understand not just what was forbidden, but why it was sacred. They learned that every action echoed beyond themselves, affecting the lineage, the land, and the soul. Morality was not fear-based, it was relational. Justice was not imposed, it was lived. And the greatest honor was not wealth or status, but being recognized as one who walked in alignment with Omenani. In the modern world, where laws often serve power rather than people, Omenani offers a radically different model. One that places spirit at the center. One that seeks not control, but coherence. One that understands that true order does not begin with laws written on paper, but with laws etched into the soul. As the Igbo elders say, Igbo law was not created, it was inherited from the gods. And what is inherited from the gods does not fade. It waits, it remembers, and it calls us back to truth. In ancient Kemet, what the world now calls Egypt, the concept of law went far beyond human invention. It was divine, eternal, and intricately woven into the architecture of the cosmos. That law was Ma'at, not a book, not a judge, not a decree, but a principle so sacred it was personified as a goddess. Ma'at embodied truth, balance, justice, and order, the very forces that held the universe together. Without Ma'at, chaos would reign. With Ma'at, harmony flourished. She was more than mythology. She was the invisible architecture upon which all of Egyptian life and governance was built. Ma'at was often symbolized by a single white feather, elegant, light, and precise. Kings wore it as a badge of divine duty. Scribes wore it as a mark of ethical responsibility. The feather was not just symbolic, it was a measure. In the judgment hall of the afterlife, it became the most important object in existence. Every soul, upon death, faced the scale of Ma'at. On one side was the heart, the seat of emotion, thought, and memory. On the other side, the feather. If the heart was heavy with lies, injustice, or imbalance, the soul could not pass. If it was light and true, the soul was welcomed into the eternal fields of peace. This wasn't metaphor. It was spiritual technology, designed to hold every individual accountable, not to law books, but to cosmic truth. Ma'at governed every part of life in Kemet. In the courts, it demanded ethical conduct from both judges and plaintiffs. A trial was not about who could argue better. It was about what aligned with Ma'at. Evidence had to match not just the facts, but the spiritual integrity of the situation. In the realm of commerce, Ma'at demanded fairness. Traders, merchants, and scribes operated under strict codes that ensured balance in scales, prices, and contracts. Cheating was not just dishonest, it was a crime against Ma'at, a disruption of divine order.
Spiritual purity was another pillar of her domain. Priests and priestesses had to undergo rigorous purification rituals before entering temples. Cleanliness wasn't just physical, it was moral, energetic, and emotional. Speaking falsehoods, harboring envy, acting unjustly, all of these were seen as spiritual impurities that could disqualify one from sacred service. And beyond the temple, Ma'at governed the relationship between people and nature. Rivers were honored, animals respected, land treated as a living entity. To poison the Nile or exploit the earth was to act against Ma'at, to disturb the balance that kept the ecosystem and the soul alive. Perhaps most revolutionary was Ma'at's influence over rulership. Pharaohs were not absolute tyrants, they were divine stewards. Their legitimacy depended not on wealth or conquest, but on how faithfully they upheld Ma'at. Their success was judged not in gold, but in balance. A pharaoh who strayed too far from Ma'at invited droughts, invasions, and internal decay. The crown did not make one divine, living in Ma'at did. Governance in this system was a sacred responsibility to uphold balance for all living beings, not to accumulate personal power. To live in Ma'at was to walk in truth, speak with balance, and govern with humility. This was not just a proverb, it was the guiding ethic of an entire civilization. Children were taught the 42 affirmations of Ma'at, personal declarations like, I have not stolen, I have not lied, I have not polluted the water, I have not harmed the innocent. These weren't threats of punishment. They were reminders of how to live in alignment. In today's world, where truth is often twisted, justice sold, and balance ignored, Ma'at stands as a timeless reminder that real law is not about domination. It is about harmony. It is not about punishment. It is about purification. And it is not enforced by fear, but sustained by the quiet, constant rhythm of truth. Kemet did not build its greatness on ambition alone. It built it on Ma'at. And that feather still floats, waiting to be remembered, not just in books and temples, but in how we choose to live, speak, and lead.
In the highlands of Ethiopia, where mountains meet sky and ancient kingdoms whisper through stone churches and sacred scrolls, a legal code emerged that fused divine order with earthly governance. It was called the Fetha Negest, the law of the kings. Revered as one of the oldest codified systems in Africa, the Fetha Negest served as the constitutional and spiritual foundation of Ethiopian civilization for centuries. It was more than legislation. It was a covenant, a bridge between divine will and royal authority. The origins of the Fetha Negest trace back to the 13th century, but its spirit is timeless. Written in Ge'ez, the classical language of Ethiopia, and deeply influenced by both early Christian teachings and indigenous African wisdom, it represented a unique synthesis. The ethics of the gospel merged with the ancestral values of communal justice, sacred kingship, and spiritual accountability. While colonial powers elsewhere imposed their legal systems through conquest, Ethiopia retained the Fetha Negest as a sovereign expression of its identity, a testimony to its spiritual independence and moral vision. At the heart of the Fetha Negest was the concept of righteous kingship. The emperor, or Negus, was not merely a ruler by bloodline or conquest, but a servant of divine order. His legitimacy came not from force, but from fidelity to God's higher laws. The king was expected to govern with humility, wisdom, and justice, upholding the dignity of his people and protecting the moral fabric of the land. Power was not his to wield, it was his to guard. And when a king violated that sacred trust, he too could be held accountable. In Ethiopia, the crown bowed to heaven. Mercy and atonement were central pillars of the legal system. Punishment was never about vengeance, it was about purification. Offenders were given opportunities to confess, to seek forgiveness, to make amends. The goal was to cleanse the soul and restore peace within the community. Forgiveness was not weakness, it was spiritual strength. The Fetha Negest taught that justice without compassion was imbalance, and that every heart deserved a path back to grace. Community accountability was another cornerstone. Justice was not the burden of a distant elite. It was the responsibility of the collective. Elders, priests, and local leaders were all involved in resolving disputes, mediating conflict, and guiding moral conduct. The judge in Ethiopia was often also a priest, one who did not separate law from prayer or verdict from virtue. Before rendering judgment, they would pray, not to reinforce religious authority, but to attune themselves to divine wisdom. A decision in this context was not an assertion of power. It was a reflection of higher truth. This theocratic legal system respected not only individual rights, but communal bonds. Marriage, inheritance, land disputes, and even royal succession were governed by codes that emphasized mutual respect, sacred duty, and generational continuity. Women were afforded protections rooted in both biblical compassion and traditional matrilineal values. Children were seen not just as extensions of the family, but as sacred trusts. Every aspect of life was connected to the divine. What made the Fetha Negest extraordinary was its understanding that all earthly power must ultimately yield to something greater. Law, in this tradition, was not a tool of control. It was a spiritual alignment. The emperor could be challenged by clergy. A judge could be corrected by scripture. A community could call for repentance from a leader. The hierarchy of Ethiopian law was not based on fear, but on faith. In a world that often separates church from state, spirit from structure, the Fetha Negest offers a vision where law is both just and sacred, where rulers are humble, where communities are conscious, and where justice is not just legal, but luminous. In Ethiopia, the law bowed only to heaven, and in that bow, it rose to its highest moral potential. Across the vast and diverse landscape of Africa, from the forests of Nigeria to the mountains of Ethiopia, from the savannas of southern Africa to the Nile Valley, there emerged sacred legal systems that, while unique in form, echoed one another in spirit. Whether one spoke of Yoruba's Orunmila, Igbo's Omenani, or Zulu's Ubuntu, there was an unmistakable thread connecting them. A belief that law was sacred, balance was central, and justice was not an instrument of fear, but a pathway to harmony. African law, in its purest form, was not simply about rules, it was about relationship with self, with others, with spirit, and with the land. One of the most profound shared principles across African civilizations was that harmony was more important than punishment. Law was not designed to create fear, but to preserve alignment. When a person transgressed, the question wasn't how harshly they could be punished. The question was, how can balance be restored? That meant understanding not just what someone did wrong, but what energies, relationships, or sacred pacts had been disrupted. The community's priority wasn't vengeance, it was healing. Because in African thought, the individual and the collective were intertwined. If one suffered, all were affected. Spiritual offenses were never seen as private feelings. They were communal consequences. If someone violated a taboo, be it dishonoring an elder, desecrating a sacred site, or harming a member of the community, it wasn't just an insult to social order. It was an offense to the spiritual order that held the community together. Misfortune, illness, drought, or conflict were often interpreted as signs that something had gone spiritually wrong, and it was the duty of the community to uncover and resolve the root imbalance. Law, therefore, wasn't just legal, it was diagnostic. And justice was the treatment. Throughout the continent, the keepers of law were not soldiers or enforcers. They were elders, priests, diviners, and wise ones who had undergone deep initiation. Their authority didn't come from political power. It came from spiritual discipline, life experience, and ancestral recognition. These elders carried memory. They were the living libraries of moral tradition, and they ruled not with fear, but with wisdom. People followed their judgment not because they were afraid, but because they trusted it. That trust was sacred, and it created a social order rooted not in coercion, but in respect. Restitution was another unifying theme. Unlike modern systems that lean heavily on incarceration and isolation, African justice systems emphasized making amends. If someone stole, they returned what was taken, often with additional compensation. If a person caused harm, they faced the victim and their community, not to be condemned, but to take responsibility. Rituals of apology, symbolic reconciliation, and offerings were common. The goal was not to destroy the offender, it was to transform them, to return them to the rhythm of communal harmony. This principle restored both parties, the one harmed and the one who harmed, and healed the community as a whole. African law also placed deep emphasis on the protection of land, women, and children, not as property but as sacred trusts. The land was not just territory, it was a living ancestor, a source of life, and a spiritual presence. Violating the land was a grave offense, not just ecologically but spiritually. Women were seen as carriers of lineage and life, and were protected by both social and spiritual laws. Children were understood as the future of the community, and were raised not only by families but by entire villages. Ancestral covenants ensured that their well-being was a collective responsibility. These shared themes across tribes, languages, and landscapes formed the foundation of a deeply rooted African legal consciousness. A consciousness that saw justice not as force, but as flow. Not as punishment, but as participation. Not as a structure to fear, but a way of life to honor. As one proverb wisely says, Africa's laws didn't just build kingdoms, they built balance. And that balance, when remembered and respected, is powerful enough to build futures. When European colonizers arrived on African soil, they didn't come only with weapons and flags. They came with courts, codes, and concepts of law utterly foreign to the continent's sacred systems. They looked at Africa's divine laws, Omenani, Ma'at, Ubuntu, and called them primitive. They dismissed spiritual alignment as superstition and treated centuries of wisdom as if it were ignorance. And with the stroke of imperial pens, they began replacing laws born of spirit with laws born of empire. The oracles and elders who had once upheld balance were suddenly stripped of authority. In their place stood foreign judges in robes, delivering judgments in languages the people didn't speak, according to rules the ancestors never recognized. These courts weren't designed to heal. They were built to control. Where restitution had once restored relationships, prisons now severed them. Where confession had once cleansed the soul, punishment now crushed it. Justice became cold, impersonal, and detached from community. The colonial legal systems were designed to serve the state, not the spirit. They replaced communal responsibility with individual blame and sacred accountability with bureaucratic enforcement. A crime was no longer a rupture in the moral fabric of the village. It was an offense against the colonial order to be met with confinement, surveillance, and erasure. Land disputes were decided without honoring ancestral ties. Marriages were judged by foreign standards. Sacred taboos were ignored, and the deep intelligence of indigenous justice was buried beneath colonial courts. The result was more than legal chaos. It was spiritual disorientation. Communities lost their compass. Generations grew up without the rituals that once taught them how to live in alignment. Instead of seeking wisdom from elders, people learned to fear courtrooms and police. The shift created not only disorder, but a deep rupture in identity. What was once sacred became suspect. What was once justice became trauma. They didn't just colonize land, they colonized law. And with it, they colonized the soul. Africa's sacred laws were not lost. They were buried beneath colonization, confusion, and centuries of silence. But burial is not erasure. A seed is buried too, and one day it breaks the surface. Ma'at still floats, her feather light as breath, weighing our hearts in silence. The ancestors still whisper in dreams, in wind, in the pauses between our thoughts. And Omenani still remembers. Though we may have forgotten the codes, the rituals, the names, they have not forgotten us. They wait, not in books or temples, but in our blood, our bones, our breath. To reclaim these laws is not merely to reject Western systems. It is to remember who we were before we were told who to fear. It is to walk not in rebellion, but in rhythm. These divine laws were not about rules. They were about resonance. They were how people lived in sacred relationship with each other, with the land, with the unseen. Reclaiming them now is not just about justice. It is about spiritual balance. It is about healing the fracture between who we are and who we were meant to be. So to everyone listening, may the divine laws return to your memory. May Ma'at weigh gently on your heart. May Omenani guide your decisions. May Allah bless the path beneath your feet. May your chi rise with clarity. And may the ancestors walk beside you, whispering courage into your soul. This is not just history. This is alignment. This is spirit calling you home. Like this video, if your spirit remembers something it cannot explain. If something in you stirred, not with fear, but with fire. If your bones heard the truth in this story, then don't let it end here. Comment below. I walk with Ma'at, or Omenani still lives. Let the world know that the law still breathes. Subscribe for more sacred systems of truth and stay close. Because next, we unveil a story even older than Moses. A story of African prophets whose voices were silenced by history, but not by spirit. The time of remembering has begun, and you are part of it.